one of, if not the most influential people, character, however you want to put it, of my time for sure, and maybe all time, one of the best to ever make an appearance on the big screen. They've been in productions in 2002, 2006, and even as recent as 2020. I wish I could have them here to introduce to you this morning, but I asked him, and he said he couldn't make it, but that I could introduce him. It just had to be by way of his typical introduction, and so I'll introduce him to you this way. I would ask, "Who do you think you are?" And he would say, "Scooby Dooby Doo." You see, there's throughout his time on the big screen, especially in 2006 and then in 2020, we learned something from Scooby-Doo about sacrifice. When they're on Spooky Island in 2006, he's given this opportunity to be a sacrifice, and he's so excited about it. He's like, yes, a sacrifice. And then he learns what all that's going to entail. And he's like, I don't want to be that anymore. I want my friend Shaggy. But then later, in the 2020 movie Scoob, this opportunity is presented again for him to be a sacrifice. But this time he faces it a little differently. See, throughout the plot of this movie and in their typical villain fighting ways, they come to this point of decision where, for some reason, Fred and Daphne and Velma aren't the ones to have to make the call or do this brave thing, but it always comes down to Shaggy or Scooby for some reason. And throughout the plot of this movie, and they fight these villains, and they need to trap them in the underworld that has been set up by Alexander the Great and his dog, his best friend, Peritas. And they've trapped him back in this place, but now the only way to lock them in there, to keep them in there, is for one of the best friends to be sacrificed. So we get into this commotion going back and forth where Scooby's like, I'll do it for you, Shaggy. And Shaggy's like, no way, bud, I'm going to do it. And there's this medallion on the front of this door. It's got a paw print on one side and a hand print on the other. So naturally, in their argumentative nature, they start flipping this medallion back and forth. Hand print, paw print, hand print, paw print. So much so to the point that they get to spinning it so fast, they're missing the medallion, and Scooby's just slapping Shaggy in the face at this point. They've lost realization on what they're even doing. But there's something we can learn from this eagerness to sacrifice. Now, getting into our text this morning, it's going to be Romans chapter 12 and the first two verses. But before we get there, being in chapter 12, that means there's been a lot of ground covered up to this point. So just briefly over the first 11 chapters of Romans, we've seen this letter written to the church, a mixed church. There's Jews in this church who believe, yes, salvation by grace, but we better keep the law. And then there's the non-Jews that are here, and they're like, yes, salvation by grace. Let's live however we want. And so Paul addresses this throughout the first 11 chapters. He addressed all of you are under sin. But through this 11 chapters, he introduces how God goes about saving sinners. But we have a paradigm shift here coming into chapter 12. He's changing from doctrine to duty, what they're supposed to do now. And we know that this is connected because chapter 12 begins with the infamous word, therefore. Our purpose in this lesson this morning is to see God's call to a sacrificial life so that we can engage in this transformation process that we'll talk about. And we're going to see that by way of 4 points. It may not be biblical, but we're going to have 4 points this morning. It's that we must perform, not conform, in order to be transformed so that we can inform. So let's go to the text and read this first verse here, Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Immediately following, therefore, we get this word, I urge you. This is a call for, this is a summoning. This isn't an empty word where it's like, oh, hey, this is a recommendation, you should do this. But an urge is something that requires a response on the other end. It can't be left at this urging, but it requires a response. And he offers them the response they should have. He said, in view of God's mercies, which we know as providing what is needed, but not what is deserved. And that's kind of been the theme of the book so far is God's mercy. And for this mixed church of Jews and non-Jews, we've really been able to see that God isn't only mercy, but the plurality of it here says, by the mercies of God, which really shows to us that God becomes any kind of mercy. Mercy not being deserved, but what is needed. He becomes whatever is needed. Whatever kind of mercy it is that they need, God is that. And he says, in view of this, present, offer, dedicate. I'm urging you to respond in this way, to freely give to God what is already his. He said, present your bodies as living and holy sacrifices. And a sacrifice for them, it's nothing new. Especially for these Jews, they've lived a life of offering sacrifices left and right for this and for that. And there's two sacrifices that we can see in view here. The first, we see the sin offering, the sin sacrifice that they would make. But we see that fulfilled now in Christ Jesus. He is that sin offering, and that is his mercies. He sacrificed for us, not a sacrifice that we deserve, but one that we so desperately needed. But then more of the forefront of the sacrifice that we're looking at this morning is the burnt offering, the dedication sacrifice. And he's saying that sacrifice is now to be you. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Dedicate your life fully to him in response to salvation. Jews, not law-keeping for salvation. Greeks, Romans, not just what you want to do, but offer your bodies in view of this, a life for him. And the thing about this burnt offering is the fire that was used for this burnt offering was supposed to never go out. Present your bodies, present your lives day in, day out as a sacrifice to him, a life worthy of living for him. It's not a decision that you make only on Sunday, maybe Wednesday night. It's continual. That fire to live for him should never go out. That's the sacrifice that they're called to here and that we are called to. But we can't just expect ourselves to perform the sacrifice just because it's what's said. There's some things that go into it, and we'll move to verse 2 to see some of those now. He says, and do not be conformed to this world. So now we move from perform to conform. And when we see this word conform, we think of fashioning of self to the ways, to the pattern of another. Shaping our lives to match someone else's, the things that someone else is doing. A way that we've always seen it is water. When you pour it into this glass container, it shapes. It takes the shape of this container. It conforms to the pattern of the container. And this urge to conform no longer, saying if you are conforming to the world, then you're choosing, you're performing, but not in the way that I urged you. You are choosing to look like the rest of the world. You are choosing to shape your container like water poured into a glass. From our scripture reading this morning, Romans 8:6, for the mind set on the flesh is death. When we shape to this container, to the pattern of the world, to the fleshly desires, to the fleshly influence, when our mind becomes set on this flesh, what's waiting for us? Pretty simply put, death. See, but another thing that we can remember real quick from Romans 8 was he said that the mind set on the flesh is death. So tuck that away and keep that for a second, that it has to do with the mind. We think so often in conforming and about how we're not going to do it. We think about this term that we often hear, Christian counterculture. Being different from everyone else, being set apart, being able for our differences to be seen among them. That way we're not confused with these people. We don't look like these people. It's the idea of fashioning ourselves not after the world, but against the world. But why? Why would we not conform when that's what surrounds us? It's so easy to look like these people. Why would we not just conform, to give in to those things? And it's because we've lived in sin and death already. We know what it's like to want to be different, to feel empty. We've been like the world. We've been of the world and in the world. We've seen it. And that's when we decided to come to Christ. So we don't want to conform any longer because we've already been there. We've been in that shape. And we say no more. So this urge here is not to shape to our glass container like a liquid form, like water would, but to remain in a solid state. I think of those states of matter like a rock, something strong. When you put water into the glass, it shapes to it. But if I drop this rock in a glass jar, not only is it not going to shape, it's going to break it. When we remain strong, firm, solid, not only do we not shape to the mold, we break the mold. But there's a certain way that we have to go about doing that, and that's what we see in this next section of verse 2. After it says, do not be conformed to this world, it says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's where we go now, is to transform. When we think of transforming and changing into another form, the word here is metamorpho, which we often go to and it's like, oh, metamorphosis. Yeah, caterpillar to butterfly. Completely new form, different thing. One crawls around and eats leaves and the other flies. It pollinates. Completely different things. But I think maybe an even better picture for us. One more fitting for the kind of transformation that we want to seek. See, the same word for transform is also used on the Mount of Transfiguration. In Jesus' transfiguration, he transforms to a completely different form. When he goes up, he's a man. But amidst being at the top of this mountain, something happens. He transforms in a way unknown, unseen by anyone else before. He becomes divine brightness, so much so they can't even bear to look. And should that not be the goal for our transformation? Not to go from crawling to flying, but maybe to go from the state of man to a state of showing the divine brightness of God through us. So bright that the sinful man can maybe hardly bear to look. Because light exposes darkness. It lets us see that sin and it can't hide anymore. This is the kind of transformation that we want to seek. There's two things that we can learn from transformation here. Going back to that Romans 8:6 passage, it said the mind set on the flesh is death. So it has something to do with the mind. And we see, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So we learn here that that's where it starts. This is where transformation begins. It begins in the mind. I have a little sister, 9 years old, and the ways that our mind work differently really brings this out for me. She likes playing with Play-Doh, and when she pulls it out of the bucket, I see a yellow lump. That's all it is. It's just a ball. It was shaped like whatever container it was in. But when she pulls it out, she sees so many different things. I see yellow lump. And when she pulls it out, she has yellow lump. But what she sees is my doll right here, blonde hair. My cows over here, this is going to be a hay bale. Jaxon, for you, I'm going to make you a lemon cake. Transformation begins in the mind. It begins with the mind. If we don't have a vision, it can never come to fruition. If she didn't see that lemon cake, she would never make it for me. If she never saw that hay bale, the cows would never get to eat it. Transformation begins in the mind. If it doesn't start there, we can try, but it won't work. We can try to just change our actions, and it may work for a little bit, but it won't work always. And that's where we get to the next thing that we learn from transformation, is that our minds have to be transformed. We can't white knuckle our way, because the verb here is be transformed. He didn't say, you go transform your mind, be better, think better. He said, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. See, the one that does this renewing is God. It's not us. We are the ones being transformed. Just like that Play-Doh is being transformed, there's someone behind the work. And for us, that's God. Through His Word, through His own sacrifice of His Son, when we recognize that, when we see that, when we decide to perform and not conform, He begins to transform our mind. Transforming it from death to life. Romans 8, again, he says, for the mind set on the flesh is death, but the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace. God's transformation brings us from that state of death to a state of new life. But where does that take us? We must perform, not conform, but be transformed. So that why? So that we can inform. The latter part of verse 2 here says, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good, acceptable, and perfect. You need a purpose statement for your sermon? There it is. There's our so that. To prove, to try, to examine, to test like we're in a laboratory. We test out, we seek, we examine what God's will is. And what that tells us here is the so that of transformation is spiritual discernment. But transformation of the mind is a prerequisite for that spiritual discernment. Spiritual discernment is the mark of a growing Christian. We begin to be able to seek out, to find, to know, to follow, to listen. But we don't get there without the transformation that comes before it. While your mind is still set on the flesh, you're dead. When it becomes set on the Spirit, when transformation begins, discernment begins. You begin to prove, but not just to yourself, not just your own thinking changing, and now I can see this thing, but you prove it to others also. God's will is not just for us to know His will, but to do it, to take part in His will. This spiritual discernment takes me to John 8:31 and 32, where He's like, if you follow my command, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. When you live it out, it sets you free. You've got to do more than know it. You have to take part in His will. And there's freedom within that will. He not only wants us to know it and do it, but He wants us to enjoy it because it is good, it is pleasing, and it's perfect. Again, we must perform, not conform, in order to be transformed so that we can inform. This all begins as an offering. The urge is there, the call is there, the summoning is there. It's been given. It's our turn to answer, to offer. It's our turn to choose. A mind set on the flesh or on the Spirit. I won't say wise, it was Matt Gloy. But a man once said that man's going to do what man wants to do. If man wants to live by the flesh, he's going to do it. But if man wants to have his mind transformed and live by the Spirit, he's going to do that too. So it's our turn to choose. Choose not to play church, but choose to live Jesus. To choose to resolve no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight, but have the things that are higher, the things that are nobler, allure our sight. It's our time to choose to hasten to Him. We look at Shaggy and Scooby, these characters that we can laugh at, but also we can learn from. In their moment of sacrifice, they don't care any longer about what's going to happen to them because they see their best friend on the other side and said, I am willing to sacrifice for you. Are we going to transform our mind and say, I don't care about the cost of sacrifice because I look and I see my Lord on the cross and I'm willing to sacrifice for Him because He's done it for me? If Shaggy and Scooby can do it, so can we. So can we. And our text would tell us that's the only logical thing. See, the spiritual service of worship, that word spiritual is rational, logical. In view of the mercy and the sacrifice of God, that's the only thing left for us to do, is sacrifice in return for Him. Before I leave you this morning, I want to offer a challenge. There's a pattern to this world. And to not be like it, we've got to go find it. So I want you to find that pattern of this world. Write down just 3 things that the world does that aren't like Christ. And each day, today, tomorrow, Saturday, choose one to be different in. And that'll bring you until we meet again Sunday morning. Some examples that you could use was, when you hear foul language, lift up praise to God instead. Be different. When you hear the gossip going on, encourage that person instead. Be different. When you see hateful actions, respond with kindness instead. You cannot transform the world as long as you're still shaped like it. Give yourself to God. Give God that Play-Doh, and let the Creator go to work, transforming you into His.